Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia, PA. And I'd like to welcome you to today's edition of People, Politics, and Prose with our host, Ron Granieri. And today we're going to be talking with Joseph de Weck, who is the author of a new book about Emmanuel Macron, and it's called Emmanuel Macron, the Revolutionary President. And I think it's fair to say that Macron is one of the most interesting leaders, if not the most interesting leader in Europe today. So it should be a very interesting discussion. Let me just give a very brief introduction of Ron Granieri, who is our longtime host of this series and several other series before this one. He's a specialist in contemporary German and international history, and he has degrees from Harvard and the University of Chicago. He's currently a professor of history at the U.S. Army War College, and he's a recipient of the Federal Chancellor Scholarship from Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. This afternoon, because Ron now works at the U.S. Army War College, we are obliged to do a disclaimer, which is that his comments do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the U.S. Army War College, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. Army. We'd also like to encourage you to check out our upcoming events. And now that we're into the full fall season, we have a lot of them coming up, so I won't list them individually, but you can go to our main website, click on the events tab at the top, and that will take you to a calendar that lists all of our events. And we encourage you to do that and sign up for those events. Also, we'll be taking your questions about midway through the program. So put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Preferably the Q&A box, not the chat, although we'll look at the chat too. In our chat, we will be featuring a link to Joseph's book, so you can order that if you wish, and we'll also be providing maps as appropriate to the discussion. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Ron. I forgot. I don't know how I could forget this, but thank you to our sponsors and members. We are indeed very grateful to you for your support. We could not do this without you. And those of you who aren't yet supporters or members, we encourage you to become members or supporters. So once again, let me turn it over now to Ron. Take it away.
Thank you, Raleigh, and thanks, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to this latest episode of People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's conversations with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. I am Ron Granieri, your host and a moderator of today's discussion. All of us at FPRI are delighted you can join us on Zoom, live here in Philadelphia, well, not necessarily in Philadelphia, but live on the internet on Zoom, and later on the internet on YouTube. It's a pleasure to have you with us. The French presidency is one of the most powerful positions in the democratic world, crafted by Charles de Gaulle to stand above party politics and allow its occupant to exert, I should say, a surprising degree of constitutional power. Recent French politicians have not known quite what to do with all that power. And the last two, Nicolas Sarkozy and François Hollande, stumbled badly and failed to gain re-election. The failure of those two presidents from the traditional center-right and center-left political parties in France created an opportunity for protest candidates, or let us say political entrepreneurs, to capture the national mood in 2017. One was populist firebrand Marine Le Pen of the newly renamed National Rally. The other was a 30-something former socialist economics minister who broke with his party and promised the French a completely new start, Emmanuel Macron. For someone who had never run for, let alone won, elected office, Macron attacked the presidential campaign with the hectic energy you would expect from a man who named his new movement La République En Marche. His win over Le Pen inspired sighs of relief from those who feared her brand of anti-establishment politics, but his behavior in office has elicited gasps from many of those same voters, from domestic interests shocked at his iconoclastic push for economic and social reforms, from international allies who have endured his criticisms of both the European Union and NATO, and from a broader community that can't quite decide whether his ambitions are too great or just enough to shake France from a decades-long malaise. This summer, France prepares for its next presidential campaign. Macron will campaign hard for re-election and will likely face a rematch with a restyled Marine Le Pen. Polls suggest he can win, but conventional analysis has struggled to predict the fate of this most unconventional president. Macron's story is told with verve and learning by Joseph de Weck in his new book, Emmanuel Macron, the Revolutionary President, a German language analysis of this man who claims to be able both to save France from itself and to represent its highest aspirations. Equal parts biography of the man and anatomy of the society that elected him, de Weck's book offers important insights into the stakes, personal and political, that ride on the 2022 French presidential elections. So who is Emmanuel Macron? What has his rise shown us about contemporary France? What are his chances of re-election? What will be his legacy? These questions and yours will guide us in conversation today with our guest, Joseph de Weck. Joseph de Weck is a fellow in the European Security Initiative at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the author of Emmanuel Macron, de Revolutionnaire Président. Joseph writes a monthly column on French foreign policy for International Politique Quarterly from the German Council on Foreign Relations and heads the European research shop at a macroeconomic and geopolitical risk consultancy. He has a background in financial and trade diplomacy, coordinating Switzerland's financial services policy toward the EU and serving as secretary to the Swiss government's Brexit task force. Joseph holds a BSc from the London School of Economics and an MA from Sciences Po and the University of St. Gallen. With all of those qualifications and with this terrific book, we are delighted to welcome him today to People, Politics, and Prose. Welcome, Jo de Weck.
Many thanks, Ron, for having me. Many thanks also to Rolly and to everyone who's listening in.
Great. So to start at the most basic level, what led you to decide to write a biography of Emmanuel Macron?
So I moved to Paris 4 years ago, just when Emmanuel Macron was elected, just in April 2017. And so I have lived or have observed France with him, in a sense, with him at the power and with him driving a lot of the conversations that are happening in France. And it have been really turbulent years. There have been a lot of strikes, there are a lot of protests, there has been terrorism, there has been Notre Dame that went up in fire. So it has been really, really tough years for France in the last 4 years. And I wanted to tell the story of France and his politics to a foreign audience because France is still a story worth to tell. And Macron is really one of the most interesting, or I think the most interesting politician I have seen in my lifetime in Europe.
Interesting. Well, and that's the thing, right? He's hard to describe, as he is hard to place on the political spectrum. Does his rise to power, is it a sign of the collapse of traditional politics in France? Or is he a harbinger of a positive rebirth of French politics?
Well, it sort of depends on what you think the traditional French political system should look like. Mm-hmm. If you think that Charles de Gaulle is sort of, the template for French politics, then he certainly would incarnate a rebirth of a traditional French politics. As Charles de Gaulle, he's someone who despises sort of the terms left and right. He considers himself a patriot, as Charles de Gaulle did in his time. Like Charles de Gaulle, he's someone who has centralized all the power in the Élysée. He is someone who takes most decisions himself. And he governs very hierarchically, top down, with a staff of technocrats. Mm-hmm. And he believes that there is this bond between the president of the republic and its peoples, and that there is a direct link or a direct conversation happening between the sovereign, him, and the French public. Mm-hmm. All of this is very traditional, or it's very Gaullist in a sense. But it breaks with the more recent past, where France has moved towards a more classical system of changing presidents from left and right-wing parties, moving back and forth in a traditional party setup. So in a sense, it's a return to the very beginning of the Fifth Republic.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's what I find so fascinating about the way you describe the story. Because, of course, when de Gaulle creates the Fifth Republic, and I think it's fair to say that, so much he created it with the help of whoever was around him. But when he creates it, he is a mature man, right? He is, when he becomes president of the Fifth Republic, he's 68 years old. He's been general. He's been a politician, been engaged in political life for a long time. And so when he says, I am France, people might roll their eyes, but they would kind of believe it. When a man who's barely 40 years old becomes president of France and decides to run the place the same way, how has that been received by the French, right? Do they welcome the return to these traditional sentiments, even coming from the mouth of a much younger and politically at least less experienced man, or do they bristle at that?
Well, both in a sense. I mean, one of the enigmas of Macron's presidency is in the first round of the presidential elections, he just got around 25% of the vote. Mm-hmm. So he's governing as president of France with these great powers that are much bigger than for most sort of Western, democratic leaders. But in fact, his democratic legitimacy is small to some extent. Only 24% supported his program. If we compare that to Charles de Gaulle, he also had to go through 2 rounds in the presidential elections. He never won an outright majority from the beginning, but a much larger share of the population supported him. Mm-hmm. So this explains this sort of tension that we see in French society. You have someone like de Gaulle who's governing top down and wants to take on this sort of, clear leadership figure, but at the same time, he doesn't have as much support as de Gaulle had at the beginning, at least, of his presidency.
So how should we understand Macron's personal story? I made several references to being young, but how does somebody go from being born in Amiens, so relatively provincial, to becoming president of France in the first campaign he ever ran? How did he do it?
In a sense, in the US, you have the American dream. You have this sort of rags to riches idea. In France, you have the Republican dream. And the Republican dream is that sort of through public services, through the public education system, you are able to rise through the ranks and, even get to the top of the country and become president. And Macron sees himself in that way. His family has been, a family of sort of working class people, his grandparents who managed to rise through the ranks through the education system. His grandmother has become a teacher. His parents are doctors. And so he sees himself as sort of part of this social mobility story, guided by the sort of public services of the Republic. Then, however, Macron is, from the very beginning of his life, it seems, someone who's really has his own ideas and has his own mind. I mean, if we think about it, for example, he, at a very young age, at age 6, he decided that he wanted to live with his grandmother instead of his parents' place. Later, he decided that he wanted to be baptized at age 12 or so, even though he grew up in a non-religious family. And then at age 15, 16, he falls in love with a woman 24-year-old older than him, who is a teacher in his school, and decides to go away from Amiens, this sort of city in the northern industrial part of France, to live in Paris and pursue his love with this woman. So he's someone who really has his own ideas, who takes decisions and doesn't mind if, this love story goes back to the 1990s. Back then, this was even much more controversial than it would be today. So at least you can say he's very ambitious and he knows what he wants and he's ready to get there.
Which I suppose are all good qualities in somebody that you want as a president. His personal life, we don't have to talk about it for very long, but it is fascinating both for what you described, that this is the age difference, but of course it's also fascinating because it seems that unlike most of the previous presidents of France, his married life is actually quite conventional. And this is an interesting paradox, right? That he doesn't have a second family like Francois Mitterrand. He doesn't have, he's not famous for being divorced multiple times like Nicolas Sarkozy. He's not having an affair with an important journalist like Francois Hollande. So in that sense, he is a little bit more like General de Gaulle, which I when I think about that, I find that very puzzling, right? Because de Gaulle always propagated this very cozy domesticity with his wife.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's sort of funny because it shows the sort of contradictions in Macron. On the one hand, his love story is something that is very controversial, and it is something that a lot of people like about him, and it's something he uses politically, to sort of show, like, I'm this person that decides on my own and that goes against the grain if needs be. But at the same time, as he's been married for a long time, the French people don't really talk about it. Brigitte Macron has a role that is quite, quite normal, no scandals. So yeah, there's the conventional and extravagant in one person.
Yeah, which of course is why he's worth writing a book about, I guess, or at least one. But
yeah, I mean, if there weren't contradictions, it would be boring to write a book about someone.
Indeed. So I want to. Macron is sui generis in a lot of ways, but I want to push a little bit by considering some of the existing labels in politics. Is Emmanuel Macron a populist?
No, I don't think he is a populist. I think he is someone who really has relatively sort of clear ideas about what he wants to do, and he's trying to sell these ideas to the French people. He's trying to convince them of the good value of his ideas. And the best example for this is the idea of a deeper integration and the European Union. France is a country with a very ambivalent relationship with the European Union. Most sort of big integration steps in the EU, if we think about the currency union, have been ideas by French diplomats or French politicians. But at the same time, it has not only been the driving force of the European Union, but the French have also been always the country that, brings the project to a halt. If we think about Charles de Gaulle with his politics of the empty chair to protest a more supranational Europe. If we think also about the vote on the European Constitution in 2002, that the French voted no on. So the French have a very difficult relationship with Europe, because on the one hand, they see it as something, that could enhance their power and help them, bring their vision of politics on a global scale. But at the same time, they fear this sort of loss of power and dilution of sovereignty if they would integrate in Europe. And Macron really tries to convince the French of the advantage of Europe. And this is not what a populist does. A populist doesn't try to, he's not an idealist. He doesn't try to convince people of ideas. Rather, he tries to cater to them.
And that's what I think is so interesting, that he challenges the existing political structure, but in the name of, let's say, some traditional, or at least some establishment goals from earlier days.
Absolutely.
And so how is that playing out in his relationship with the French National Assembly, with the legislative body, or with his cabinet? He had to create a political party from scratch. And how's that working in terms of getting laws passed?
So basically what we've seen is under Macron, really a hyper centralization of power. He founded this party from scratch. Most of the people or a lot of people who are on the list weren't politicians before, and suddenly became MPs. So they all know exactly whom they owe their seats to and their political power. So Macron and the Élysée really controls the parliament pretty much directly from the Élysée, which gives him an enormous power. In a sense, he's much more powerful than Hollande or Sarkozy were at the time. They had a majority in parliament as well, but they had an established party they had to cater to, and different factions that they had to listen to. so much less powerful than Macron. And this is, in a sense, one of the criticisms about Macron. This sort of top-down approach, this control of parliament and the institutions helps him really to get through his reforms, much more so than his predecessors did. So he really delivers on a lot of things. But at the same time, he turns France even more into this sort of centralized state with a hyperpower at the center. That is also one of the structural problems of French society and the state.
And that makes him different from his predecessors, right? Because even Sarkozy and even, I guess not so much Hollande, but there have been previous French presidents who have tried to be above politics, and yet they have, outside of de Gaulle himself, right? They've run into problems. How is it that he, for example, hasn't had to face an anti-presidential majority in the National Assembly? Is this good luck? Is this the fragmentation of his enemies, or is it just is it a tribute to you mentioned this organization that he knows he can count on his people? But he's been awfully fortunate compared to previous French presidents.
Oh yeah, he's been awfully fortunate. I mean, like his election is an accident of history. If you think about it, normally, after François Hollande, the center-right candidate François Fillon should have won the election, but there was a corruption scandal. He tripped over that, and without this, I think Macron wouldn't have acceded to the presidency. Then there afterwards, that he still controls the majority in parliament and the institutions is just because since Sarkozy, the presidential election is followed immediately by the parliamentary election. So usually it makes sense for the French to give a mandate to a president and then afterwards to elect his party also and to give him a majority in parliament. It has to be said that the French system is majoritarian. So basically it's not like a German style parliament where you have proportional seats. So it suffices sort of to have 25-26% in the first round to make it to the second round and then get a majority in parliament. Right. So in France, the opposition really comes from the street and not from the institutions or inside the institutions. And obviously, this is something Macron has seen.
Right. Well, and because that's interesting too, right? It's anybody who has studied in France, certainly anybody who's lived in France, but anybody who's visited France knows that sometimes you have to organize your visits around the scheduled strikes, and there's a certain degree of every president struggles with this or that labor union. So Macron's problems with labor, not surprising, but he's also dealt with this uprising from let's say the provincial middle class. When I say provincial in a descriptive, not a judgment form, but the so-called yellow vests who didn't like his raise on taxes. You would think that a president who had faced so many different kinds of protest movements would be, you'd think that would be a badge of not doing a very good job, but in a perverse way, Macron's ability to upset at various times people from around the political spectrum appears to be one of his strengths. Is that just another one of these wonderful paradoxes of understanding Emmanuel Macron?
Yeah, I think, one of the reasons why we have, over the last 4 years, why we had so many strikes and so many protests is because he got so much done. Much more than Sarkozy or Hollande or Jacques Chirac. He has managed in the first 2.5 years, that's before the pandemic, right, to get through a lot of economic reforms, fiscal reforms, tax reforms, education, much more than previous presidents have done. But at the same time, this sparked a lot of protests. For a long time, he was able to withstand these protests. We think, for example, the reform of the state rail operator, SNCF, or his labor market reform at the very beginning of his mandate. And he only really tripped with the yellow vests. But even with the yellow vests, that is sort of the funny thing about this, it was over months, the country was in a state of alert and a lot of hatred towards Macron. But at the same time, he pulled off this sort of magical trick with this grand debate, the sort of grand debate where in hours and hours he would go to the cities in France and debate with yellow vests, and he managed to calm down these protests. So in a sense, he was the key to sparking these protests. But he was also the key to calming them down.
Interesting. And the part of, I guess that's part of his, the personalization of his rule, that he's willing to be in direct discussion or direct confrontation with these folks. Because you mentioned in your book that he doesn't like giving press interviews, but he does like giving speeches, and he does like these sort of personal events. How does he make use of, are his personalizations, does he make big use of social media to directly reach the public? In the way when we talk about American politicians who are finding a way to reach the public directly, I can think of a certain former president of the United States who used Twitter a lot. Kids, you could look it up on your own. But does he use social media, or what does he do?
No, not to that extent. What he does is, I mean, obviously he has social media accounts, etc. But what he does is he speaks to sort of non-traditional media. He speaks to sort of, YouTubers. He speaks to fringe media, sort of like media that is sort of close to the far right or to the far left. He tries to show basically that he speaks to all kinds of specters from society, and not only sort of the establishment equivalent of the New York Times, etc. And then what he also always tries is to have this sort of direct conversation with the French. And there he's really different to his predecessors, that he, it's a risky thing. Recently, for example, when he went into a village, someone, gave him a smack, but that's also only possible because he really goes towards the people and speaks to them. And I think on balance, the people like that, because it shows that he's courageous in a sense, and that he's not, that there's no anxiety on his half to really confront people with his ideas.
Fascinating. So I want to talk a little bit about foreign policy now for a second. And you mentioned his approach, Macron's approach to Europe. That the French have often thought of a strong Europe as a vehicle for a strong France, and yet the relationship to a supranational Europe has always been a little more difficult, right? So the French like to criticize the British for not being pro-Europe, but in a lot of ways, both the British and the French have this idea that Europe should not restrain their national greatness. However, how clearly has Macron's embrace of the European Union, or his call for the European Union to do more things, how successful has he been in moving the European Union in directions that he wants to go, or moving France in the direction he wants to go towards Europe?
If you would have asked me this question about a year ago or a year and a half ago, I would have told you very unsuccessful. But today I would say very successful. And there's an explanation for that. At the beginning, he was sort of trying to convince Germans. There's this old idea in Europe that you need this sort of bilateral relationship between France and Germany to decide on areas of cooperation in EU integration. So he banked on Merkel, to get progress on sort of economic issues, the currency union, and also foreign policy questions. But Merkel, she was never sort of the very convinced European that Macron was, or that even Merkel's predecessors were, like Adenauer and Schmidt. And at the same time, she was very weak because she was at the beginning of her fourth mandate as a chancellor. And at the time, the CDU was in crisis. She was losing her grip or her control over German politics. So this sort of first approach didn't deliver anything to Macron. He didn't get anything out of it. And then he sort of turned into a second phase where he was sort of like a baby. He started screaming around and protesting. He said, like, well, if you're not giving me anything, Germany, so then I'll start complaining, and I'll do it publicly, because I want to get your attention, and I want you to react to my propositions. And this is sort of, this phase, for example, where he attacks Merkel in front, in a speech in front of Merkel for, the fetishism, the fiscal fetishism of the Germans for not wanting to, move forwards on integration in the currency union, etc. He blocks, for example, or he vetoes the accession of Albania and North Macedonia to the European Union, because he wants to tell Germany, hey, you have to listen to me and you have to engage with me because we're both in the same boat. And this didn't work somehow a bit, but not really much. It's a destructive approach. And And really, it only really, his European agenda got off the way with the pandemic. And also because he changed his strategy for a third time. Now he's not sort of banking on Germany. He's not barking anymore, but what he does instead, he's trying to build broad coalitions within the EU with lots of sort of smaller member states, Denmark, the Netherlands, Portugal, or also big ones like Italy and Spain. He tries to build a coalition for policy proposals and then goes with this coalition to Germany. And this works much better. So I think he has been successful now, and I think the biggest sort of illustrations of his success are obviously the pandemic economic recovery program. That is a huge step forward for the EU. It's probably the biggest EU integration step since the 90s. It blew away the German taboo of common debt issuance. And the second big success is this narrative of European sovereignty has become sort of the key narrative in EU debates.
And I can imagine that as he watches what's happening in Germany, the Germans, of course, will have their election before the French election. It's just in a couple of weeks from right now, that whoever becomes the next German chancellor will probably be even weaker in a way than Angela Merkel, right? Will probably be a much more fragile coalition. And as of right now, the German people aren't exactly excited about any of the three candidates. So the idea that this is a real opportunity for France and for Macron in particular to push forward his agenda for reorganizing or for pulling together the European Union.
It is, yes, but I think it would be wrong to assume that for France, a weak Germany is good. He needs someone in Berlin who is in charge of this government and, who can make deals. So he needs a strong chancellor. But I think I think now the race is down to Armin Laschet and Olaf Scholz. And I think both of them are good or are fine for France. And both are probably actually better than Angela Merkel. Olaf Scholz is quite pro-European, on Eurozone integration. He has been a great partner for the French over the past years. He's instinctively more pro-European, and the same can be said for Armin Laschet.
I noticed they both made sure to visit Emmanuel Macron just in the past week, right?
Exactly. They both went to Paris to say hi. So in a sense, I think what is a bit problematic is that it's probably going to take time until the Germans have decided on a coalition format. But thereafter, I think probably there will be a chancellor that is even more disposed to work with Macron and hopefully has the power and authority to do so.
Interesting. Well, so to take a step further, let's talk about transatlantic relations, right? Macron has called NATO brain dead, which is the sort of thing that everybody thinks, but nobody wants to say, but he went ahead and said it at one time or another. What is Macron's attitude towards European relations with the United States? Right? You say he's a good Gaullist in a lot of ways. And of course, de Gaulle had a famously ambivalent relationship with Washington. Where does the United States fit within Macron's vision for Europe and for France's place in the world?
So Macron believes in the concept of the West, and he believes Europe and the US and North America are part of the West. And he believes that there are two children of the Enlightenment, of the French and the American Revolution. So he believes that we're sort of parts of a same team. But at the same time, he believes that it has to be a team where both the US and Europe are able to talk eye to eye, and where Europe should be able to, ensure its own security, able to take sovereign decisions in foreign policy, and not rely any longer on the US. So this whole agenda of European sovereignty, in a sense, it's not directed against the US, but it's directed towards the idea that Europe has to, be sovereign, be stand its own person, and has also some differing interests from the US, even though they are a part of Team West, because Europe has a different geography. Obviously, what happens in Afghanistan, has much more immediate repercussions for Europeans than for the US, where there is, the Atlantic Ocean between the Eurasian continent and Washington. So so in a sense, he wants Europe to put its act together, but he doesn't want to break with the US. And that's sort of, the historic tradition in France. France has always had a tough relationship with the US, but at the same time, it's the only big Western European country that never fought a war against the US.
Something that we tend to forget over here in the French didn't burn Washington, for example. Speaking of special relationships,
sent Lafayette to help in the War of Independence. And also Charles de Gaulle said, if it really comes down to protecting a free world, then there are no more natural allies than France and the US. And de facto, if you see that in sort of cooperation in military affairs, there is a lot of cooperation between the US and France, and they're looking for it.
Yeah, one of my favorite de Gaulle quotes was he said once, "Whiskey is stronger than vodka," when he explained that however much France might want détente with the Russians, right? He knew where France's friends were. But this gets to a question that comes from the audience. From Gregory Bloomquist, wanted to ask about Macron's policy and about France's policies in West Africa, right? A part of the world that, for one reason or another, has been considered a primary French interest. And while the United States has gotten more interested in this region, the French have often appeared to be taking the lead in stability operations and in places like Mali and places like Cote d'Ivoire. And so how should we understand Macron's foreign policy decisions with regards to Africa?
Well, to this specific area, to the Sahel, it's obviously terrorism that is front and center. Terrorism and migration. The sort of North African coast isn't far. Migration can come from there. There are historic links, obviously, between North Africa and France. A large part of the immigration community is from North African countries. And this idea that there are in the Sahel region countries where Islamists, jihadists, come to power and create a sort of safe zone for terrorism, or even just manage to establish some kind of statehood, frightens the French. They want to defeat them there for the same reason they wanted to defeat or get ISIS out of Iraq and Syria at the time. They don't want an example for Islamists at home as well, where they can look towards to and say, they've actually managed to do something. So terrorism and migration is the big issue there. For the rest of Africa, Macron tries to sort of reboot relations with Africa that are tainted by the colonial past of the French Republic. He has made great efforts in going to Africa, saying, for example, that French colonialism was a crime against humanity, saying also that he is part of a first generation that actually has never lived through the colonial experience. The War of Independence of Algeria was already done when he was born, and that he wants to look towards the future. Obviously, France wants to look forward and towards the future, but that's not necessarily the case of France's African partners. They still have questions they want to ask. They want to have, history to be, archives to be opened, art that has been, brought to French museums to be sent back to Africa. They still have things they ask for.
Sure. So when you mentioned terrorism and migration, and I want to talk about migration and integration of immigrants in France. That one of the things you describe in the book is how Macron has tried to, in his sort of neither right nor left sort of perspective, is he proclaims himself a firm believer in France's notion that everybody in France can be French. But he also appeals to certain segments in the French population by expressing opposition to any more uncontrolled migration to France. And so how should we understand Macron's policies, especially if Europe is going to face another wave of possible migrants after the collapse of Afghanistan? Perhaps not as bad as 2015, but who knows? How does Macron's approach to migration, how does it fit in with current French policy, and how does it play politically within the debates going on in France?
I think it's pretty clear cut. Migration is something that scares a lot of the French, and to be honest, not even also within left-wing parties. If you think about 2015 and the Syrian refugee crisis, when Merkel decided to host 1 million Syrian refugees, there was François Hollande, a socialist, who was the president of France, and he didn't do what Merkel did. Sort of more migration is not something that is really popular in France, and he caters towards this. In a sense, here you could say he's a populist, or he follows the mind or sort of the standard opinion of the population. And you can see it in his reaction to the debacle in Kabul. Sort of one of his first statements was Europe has to get ready and make sure that it can protect its borders and deal with a possible migration crisis. So this is front and center for him.
Right. And do you see this as something that's going to that debates about policy will be a big factor in the presidential election, or has he already inoculated himself by taking the positions that he's taken?
I think the upcoming election won't be primarily about migration. I think that issue won't be front and center because really no one will be campaigning on that. I think it's going to be the pandemic, it's going to be the economy, and then it's going to be sort of more value questions like identity politics that are going to be discussed.
Mm-hmm. Well, and let's talk a little bit about the upcoming election, right? Are the established political parties or the established movements, so the Republicans and whatever remains of the socialist left, are they going to be more organized? Are they going to be offer a real challenge to Macron, or do you think we're going to see it's going to be Macron and Le Pen in the second round?
Yeah, I think the left hasn't managed to reorganize itself since the defeat of François Hollande in 2017. There is sort of a far left populist figure, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who had a quite impressive score in 2017, nearly 20%. And he really believes that maybe this time it is his shot where he can actually make the cut. But in reality, he is a way too divisive figure for the left to unify around, because he's quite EU skeptic or anti-European, you could even say. He's also quite egocentric as a person. So he doesn't really manage to rally the left around. So the left will be split, possibly in 3 big parties, the Greens, the Social Democrats, or the Parti Socialiste, and Mélenchon. So the left has really no chance of acceding to the second round. And on top of that, the country has shifted towards the right over the last years, not only since Macron, but since before. So the voter pool of left-wing parties has shrunk over the last 10, 20 years. So and on the right, what do you think? Do they have a candidate to the Republicans? They're looking for a candidate now. They have a couple of candidates that are potentially have some appeal, but at the same time, Macron has occupied sort of this center-right space with his politics over the last 4 years. And then you have the far right, the Rassemblement National. And if you look at polls over the last 4 years, it's really stable. 25%, like Macron, like his politics, they vote for him pretty much regardless. 25%, like Le Pen, the far-right candidate, vote for her pretty much regardless. And the center-right candidate would have to be able to gain votes from one or the other in order to get to 20, 25% and make it to the second round. It's not impossible if there would be some scandal, something that really changes the game. But if that doesn't happen, it seems very unlikely that they'll manage to. So I think we're set for a rematch of Le Pen against Macron.
And even though we're here to talk about Emmanuel Macron, you knew I was going to ask you about Marine Le Pen. So I have to ask, what should we understand about how Le Pen and the Front National, now the Rassemblement National, right, how should we understand the way that they have tried to reposition themselves in order to gain those extra votes, or at least to remove the kind of taboos that probably got in the way of her candidacy or her father's candidacy in the past?
So in 2017, Le Pen in the second round won only 34% of the votes. You could say it's a lot, but at the same time, it's still very far away from winning a second round. And in 2017, she had a sort of Trumpian campaign. It was after the election of Donald Trump, it was after Brexit, and she thought that she had to be as radical as possible and that this could pay off in the elections. Well, in the French case, it didn't pay off for her, to be very extreme in the sense, asking for a French exit from the currency union and the European Union, very big on migration and these kind of issues. Now, having realized that this sort of radical approach failed in France, she has tried to move towards the center. So she has ditched all, criticism of the EU in the sense she doesn't want the EU to leave the EU anymore like the UK did. She wants to stay in the currency union. She doesn't want to end, free migration within the European Union, which is something she wanted to end before. And also in economic policy, she's trying to move towards the center, for example, saying that France should, take care about its fiscal balance, etc., to sort of appease and, please center-right, more sort of bourgeois voters. So she's trying to move towards the center, to get closer to these 50%, which is sort of working in the polls. But there's another problem coming up. The one problem is that, people remember her. There's a big credibility issue. And the other problem is that now suddenly on the far right, a new space opens up and you have people like Éric Zemmour, who are maybe sort of, you could compare as a French Carlson Tucker or something, who's trying to, or he's thinking about running for president himself.
Oh, wow. That would be extremely unwelcome, because it would either force her to run to the right to hold on to those voters, or it would just take away voters from her. Well, that would be interesting. Yeah. Well, a question here from Kurt Wiley in the audience, going back to the transatlantic question, is something that was on my mind too, is do we have any sense, now that the dust has settled to a certain extent, about Macron's relationship with Donald Trump, and about how his either personally, but also how that shaped his political relationship with the United States?
He tried Macron. I mean, at the very beginning, when Donald Trump was elected, most of Europe snubbed Trump. They snubbed Trump mostly for reasons of domestic politics. Trump wanted to go to London, but May, canceled the visit because she was fearing, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, in the streets protesting against the visit. In Germany, Merkel, didn't want to give Trump a platform, so she didn't invite him either. But Macron, he invited him right away. And Trump came to Paris on the 14th of July, Bastille Day, the French National Day, to visit, the parade of the troops in Paris. And in a sense, this illustrates also France's particular relationship to the US. Like, the French have no issue with Trump showing up and, being in Paris, because they feel, in a sense, that they are sovereign partners on an equal footing with them. They don't feel, that they owe anything to the US in a sense as Germans or the Brits do. So the French were in a sense much less appalled by the victory of Trump than other Europeans, or shocked. So Macron tried to build this relationship with Trump, a personal relationship. Macron, was in business before as well. They have these sort of some, in their biography, some things that are kind of similar. So he tried to build this personal relationship with Trump. It didn't yield much results, like he tried to convince Trump to, reintegrate the Paris Climate Agreement. This didn't work. He tried to convince Trump to re-engage in the Iran deal. This didn't work. But then again, as a historian, you never know maybe what they've talked about and agreed on that we don't know about, and that helped. So we don't know.
We don't know. One more question from Rachel Ziemba. How would you see Macron's policies considering relations with China and Russia? How does Macron imagine France positioned in these triangular relationships with the United States deals with Russia or deals with China, and the Europeans deal with China? Where does Macron see France in all of this?
So on China, I think he wants, for example, if you think about the Huawei issue, he doesn't want Huawei in France. He's pretty much outlawed, 5G and Huawei taking place. So he wants to maintain sort of the, strategic independence of France and Europe. He wants Europe in a France that is not susceptible to blackmail from China, so able to stand its ground to China, and also especially an economic policy that is much more aggressive towards China when it comes to trade issues. But at the same time, he doesn't think France and Europe should join sort of a great power competition on the US side between China and the US. It should have its own stance, robust sort of towards China, but at the same time not suivist or not following the US on everything. On Russia, he's also in a sort of French tradition where the French believe that they have some link towards Russia. They're both countries with great histories, great writers, literature, etc. They believe that there's some link, and he tried to sort of open up to Russia and thought that some of the reasons why Russia is sort of resurgent is because the Europeans were mistreating the Russians before. So he tried to pull them in again. This didn't yield any successes, this strategy, but it cost him a lot, and it cost him a lot of political capital in Europe, especially from the Eastern Europeans. And this is something that is probably a miscalculation, because it cost him also a lot on his main project, the EU, because they felt like the French were disregarding the interests of countries like Poland, etc. And so a lot of trust has been destroyed by this approach.
So we just have a couple of minutes left. I want to ask you to do something that historians don't like to do. Journalists like to do a little bit more. And so since you're both a historian and a journalist, maybe you can do a little bit of both. And that is, obviously, if Emmanuel Macron is reelected, he'll have another 5 years to shape his legacy. If he is, however, not reelected, so if he enjoys the same fate as Sarkozy and Hollande, if he doesn't get reelected, what would his legacy be?
That very much depends on who gets elected.
Good answer.
If Marine Le Pen is elected, then his legacy would be destroyed, because his legacy is basically European integration, sort of bringing the French closer to Europe again, to support Europe. And at the same time, his second legacy would be this idea that you can have a new updated way of third way politics, integrating right-wing, liberal and left-wing policies in one person, and that this is something that the French can agree on more or less. Le Pen would mean, less Europe, and it would mean a sort of clear right-wing politics. So that would basically mean that Macron has been a failure. If he gets reelected, then obviously that's the biggest success. We know, in politics, you get imitated if you win and re-win elections. So if he would, win this election, you could imagine that other politicians in Europe and France would follow sort of his course. If the center-right candidate wins, then I think his legacy would be on Europe. It would be this next generation EU pandemic recovery program that is something no one can take away anymore. And the sort of France that has economically rebounded.
Right. So what's next for you? Now that you, obviously you'll be talking about Emmanuel Macron for quite some time to come, but yeah. What else are you going to be working on, or what are you thinking about working on next?
So I think after this, I think I'm gonna take some holidays at some point and and just spend more time reading instead of writing. And then I'm thinking about writing a play, maybe, about negotiations. You know, as a former having worked in the foreign service, I've sort of observed a lot of sort of international diplomatic negotiation situations, and I often thought that sometimes this could also be a theater play. So that's maybe a project I would like to work on. So bring international diplomacy on a theater stage.
Well, wonderful. If you do that, right, we will have you back to talk about it. But it's and it'll be a lot of fun. And you know, we didn't even get a chance. We did get a chance to talk about Brexit and your experience there, but I'll save that for another time, since that's a whole topic for itself. But Joe de Weck, it's been a delight to have you with us. We're just about out of time, but thanks so much for joining us and sharing your insights on people, politics, and prose.
Many thanks, Ron, for having me.
You bet. And ladies and gentlemen, Emmanuel Macron, de Revolutionnaire Président, is currently only available in German, but Joe was saying earlier to us that he's seeking a French and an English language publisher. And so we hope that you'll be able to get this book in English soon. But for updates on what Joe is working on, right, he certainly publishes with us at FPRI. We encourage you to follow him on Twitter at Joseph de Weck. It's his whole name. It's pretty simple to find. And we hope that you will take the time to read his few further insights on Europe, transatlantic relations, and the world. FPRI would very much like to thank our sponsors and partners for their generous support in making this program today, and all of you for joining us on Zoom. And we ask you, if you are joining us on Zoom for the first time, that you will tell a friend, that you will bring a friend next time. This conversation is just the beginning of what we do at FPRI. The world goes on, and we have a variety of programs to discuss different regions, different events, both longer term views and also short-term analyses of current events. We hope that you will, if you find our work interesting, that you will explore it further and that you will consider becoming a member, partner, or supporter of FPRI so that we can keep doing this work and so that we can keep bringing it to you. To keep up with future episodes of People, Politics, and Prose and other events at FPRI, please visit our website, fpri.org. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. It's been a delight having you today, but until next time, for all of us here at FPRI, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.